Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam, this is All Across America. All right, everyone, this is a special presentation of All Across America. It is August 29th, 2025, when this episode was recorded and released, exactly 20 years to the day when Hurricane Katrina made landfall in the city of New Orleans. As many of you know, I spent some good time in a great city living there, and I just wanted to commemorate the 20th anniversary and the history and beauty of one of America and the Earth's most amazing cities. This is a true story that I wrote some years ago, and I'm looking back on it. It was written 10, 15 years ago, prior to when Katrina made landfall. And it stands the test of time for me. There's still cringe in a few sections, which I've tried to cancel out as much as I can. But I'll give a nice postscript too, kind of amazing postscript of where all these people have ended up. They're all still living. This is all true. Some of the names have been changed to protect the not so innocent. So tune in, let's dig into it, and here we go. Darrell Breen was born and raised in the same New Orleans neighborhood where I lived in the spring of 2000. When Darrell grew up there, the neighborhood was known as the Irish Channel. He summed up his life to me with a memory of sitting on his grandfather's lap as a boy of 5. Half Irish, his grandfather says, looking at him. He bounces Darrell to the other knee. Half Italian, he says, shaking his head at Darrell. Lad, you're fucked. Italians and Irish have always been marrying for generations in America, the Italian women assuming the easy Irish surnames and keeping their Catholic faith. My cousin went from Vigliotti to Flynn. In the neighborhoods of New Orleans in the 1960s, it was not so easy for the offspring of these marriages. When I met Darrell in New Orleans, he was 43 years old. He looked and spoke like he was from a Springsteen song. A Louisiana man drawling New Orleans with a Jersey accent common to these parts. He had a thin frame, thin arms, and a scruff of beard that wouldn't grow, and a woman's hairband tied around a ponytail that slithered from the back of his head like a greasy eel. Darrell's family on his mother's side dropped off the lemon boat from Sicily. After a century in America, Darrell lived a half mile from the port where both of his sides of his family first arrived. He was one of the few remaining folks of Irish ancestry in the Channel. Like much of New Orleans, white flight to the suburbs in the 1960s changed the neighborhood demographic. The St. Thomas Projects, a low-rise housing project with sprawling dirt courtyards, dominated the character of the neighborhood for decades. When I moved in, the area had recently begun to swing towards gentrification. The realtors christened it the Lower Garden District. Darrell mentioned with pride how the neighborhood was rated one of the hippest in America by the Utne Reader, a magazine that could not be bought off the rack anywhere in the neighborhood. Darrell's people returned from the suburbs for the annual St. Patrick's Day parade, held in traditional New Orleans style. They loaded floats right below my balcony on Race Street. Hundreds of old-time, red-faced men hurled cabbages to the crowd lining the parade route up and down Magazine Street. Darrell and I were not introduced. We met on the street, on the sidewalk of St. Andrew Street, a few doors down from his house. He was kneeled over an iron gate, shaping it with a blowtorch. I walked by in a saunter, slow enough for me to stop in a neighborly greeting. Darrell took off his welder's mask to talk. We chatted a few minutes, then I headed down the street to see a building with apartments for rent. I walked into the dim lobby of the building, knocked on the first door to the right, and waited for the landlady and the sound of her walker to make their way to the door. When she finally appeared, she gave the standard summary of the rentals and closed the door. I left to continue my conversation with Darrell outside. He told me the place was a drug den and the plague of the neighborhood. Darrell opened his own business the month before called Steel Deals Ironworks. I figured he named it after the Rolling Stones album Steel Wheels because that's what he looked like, a cross between a car mechanic and a rock and roll roadie. Darrell invited me to work for him the next day. I spent a third night in a hostel on the other side of St. Charles Street, unable to escape the travelers that alighted in New Orleans to continue their Lonely Planet treasure hunt. I shared a bunk room with an Australian woman who gave massages on a cruise line and an Australian guy who was enlisted to carry her luggage since she just had a boob job and didn't want to pop a stitch. The Australian guy had spent 4 days in New Orleans and left the next morning for Disney World. He said he'd seen all that he needed to see. Like any city, New Orleans has a tourist checklist that starts from the time the shoes step off the St. Charles trolley, ready for a stroll down the French Quarter with a cup of beer in hand, cigar in mouth, and plastic beads around the neck in the August heat, tipping wrinkled jazz musicians to play the Saints again. I stood to catch a transfer bus every morning on the cusp of all this, on the corner of Canal Street, a block from Harrah's Casino, and right in front of a tourist shop that played Zydeco music in an endless loop. Ascending grades of hot sauce tempted in the window. The grand finale had a cadaverous name, something like Billy's Body Bag Hot Sauce. I stepped aside as the ladies arrived off the Desire bus from the Ninth Ward to their jobs cleaning rooms in the downtown hotels. From here, my bus swung past Jackson Square, then up Elysian Fields Avenue to the University of New Orleans in the lakefront neighborhood. 2 buses, 1 transfer, 90 minutes each way to class. Before classes began, I worked 3 days for Darryl, painting a primer coat on the raw metal he welded into a hurdle-high fence enclosing a front yard the size of 2 parked cars. I wore the oldest clothes I could find in my suitcase. Darryl wore stained jeans that tapered over his work boots and a black t-shirt. These were the only clothes I ever saw him wear. He had few possessions, didn't smoke, and only drank a little. He didn't try marijuana until well after he apprenticed on the needle. He was self-described white trash. This was a life story that began that first day. Looking back, I realized I was paid for my labor and for listening, though I was a know-it-all college kid whose opinions outweighed his experiences by 10 to 1. Darryl spent the day convincing me that Cajuns are as likely to live in New Orleans as New Mexico, and that there isn't a basement in the whole city of New Orleans. At day's end, he paid my wages from an ATM, and we walked back to his apartment. Darryl lived in a 1,000-square-foot space for which he paid $375 a month in rent. A florist living downstairs decorated the balconies of the pink building with a flair that suggested a seductress with a Gone with the Wind accent. But Darryl and the florist station wagon parked out front filled with black garbage bags shattered any fantasy. Darryl's home had the appeal of a priest's apartment at the back of a church rectory. His possessions consisted of sparse furniture pointed at the TV, pots and pans, and a stereo, a price tag away from a yard sale. The cassette rack stood empty, save a couple of greatest hits collections. He invited me to stay with him while I looked for a place, offering to drive me to the hostel and shuttle my stuff back. I agreed, but as we were ready to leave, he stopped to explain the full implications of his jail time. I stepped back and leaned over the couch, listening. If you're a convicted felon, at what point do you come clean with people about your past? Darryl decided protocol merited full disclosure with me as a potential house guest. After he left the service, Darryl got into a fight outside of a New Orleans bar and killed a man with a pipe. He didn't elaborate, but his gaze shifted as his memory recalled every frame. Darryl was convicted of manslaughter and spent 7 years at Angola State Prison outside Baton Rouge, his father's alma mater. His dad gained admission to Angola by robbing a liquor store when Darryl was a kid. Although cliche, I figured it happened so long ago before all the melodies had been played out and all the stories had been told. Maybe robbing a liquor store was still a novel idea in 1950s New Orleans. I don't remember if my thoughts scrolled through the mental rhetoric like he paid his debt to society and such. I just went ahead with the plan. I figured Darryl was the kind of guy that would give you the shirt off his back if it didn't expose the track marks on his arms. We drove across St. Charles Avenue to the hostel. My mother taught me to look both ways before crossing the street. Darryl taught me to look both ways before running a red light, gunning his white Pontiac 2-door through the intersections. Darryl talked to the manager while I got my things. The manager absorbed Darryl like an adult handling a precocious kid. I watched Darryl contain himself later that evening as he fielded a phone call from a woman who had seen his Steel Deals ad in the Times-Picayune. He called her ma'am throughout the exchange as he computed a quote in his head and assured her of his professionalism. But it's hard to have confidence in a contractor who would show up to a construction job in a car better suited for delivering pizzas. With his father in prison, Darryl and his little sister was sent to live with an aunt and uncle in Florida. He wasn't against physical punishment, but Darryl said that, as an 11-year-old kid, he didn't understand the difference between his father beating him in a drunken rage and his uncle hitting him for misbehaving. After a few months in Florida, Darryl pulled a knife on his uncle during an argument, and he was sent back to New Orleans to live with his alcoholic mother. His sister remained in Florida, and as an adult, lent Darryl money when he needed it. After he left prison, Darryl spent 10 years traveling across the world, installing gas station canopies from New Orleans to Norway. The money was good, and he met his wife along the way. They settled in Seattle, her hometown. For a time, they lived in happy stability, but he found the needle again and brought his wife into the game with him. A few years later, his wife died of a heart attack at the hands of heroin. Her family blamed Darryl for her death, and he didn't disagree. He knew he had to leave. Back to New Orleans he went. I met the other woman in Daryl's life 2 days after I moved in with him. I was helping Daryl install a chain link fence on a Habitat for Humanity house near the St. Thomas projects. Daryl preempted me, sensing in the spirit of our banter I would say something I would later regret about this dirty bag lady hobbling up the street looking like she wanted to point her finger at somebody. This was Daryl's mom. Daryl's mother lived alone and the bottle keeping her company. I tried to extrapolate her age to her son while accounting for the ravages of her lifestyle. Giving her occupation, she was pushing her luck every morning she woke up. She moved in with Daryl a few weeks later, and soon after, Daryl returned to the needle. After Daryl's mother stopped by, we resumed work trampling the freshly seeded grass at the Habitat worksite while we set the fence and Daryl told Marine stories. I managed a few months as a cadet at the United States Military Academy at West Point. I left because I didn't like authority. I lost touch with Daryl as he settled back into his addiction and I into an apartment a few blocks away on the riverside of Magazine. Though the space was as big as the coffee shop around the corner, I spent most of my time on the balcony blowing cigarette smokes into the overhanging magnolia tree. My rent was $450. Daryl gave me a plastic chair and table set for my porch. I didn't see him much after I found my place. After I tired of the 3-hour daily bus trips to school, I began to look for a car. Daryl let me borrow his ride while I went to see used cars from the classifieds. I settled on a 1988 Chevy S10 pickup truck that I found in Jefferson Parish. The Louisiana sun had turned the Navy paint job purple in places. Emergency brake didn't work, but there weren't any hills to contend with. My daily ride to the University of New Orleans took me on I-10 over the French Quarter past a billboard for vodka that read, "Don't you wish your commute was so smooth?" The exit ramp off I-10 drops you onto Elysian Fields Boulevard running north to Lake Pontchartrain and UNO's campus. UNO is a commuter school built 50 years ago on a former naval air base. The trees perch on grass humps that allowed the roots to grow over a tarmac underneath that was never stripped. The school is no different than any other suburban campus, save a few cultural subtleties like the bottles of Budweiser and fried okra for sale in the school cafeteria. Tuition was $1,200 for the semester. I had a $1,000 scholarship and paid the difference with cash. I spent more on books, mostly on an anthropology class I took as an elective for easy 2 hours of Kung and Kalahari Bushman. During a discussion of single-cell anemia and genetics, I raised my hand and made what must have been a smart comment because two guys sitting nearby approached me after class like I was a cute co-ed. The first guy introduced himself and suggested we go shooting. The second was Les Moorhead. Les had sandy blonde hair that he wears in a part and pale skin that isn't fond of the sun. He looks most like himself with Saturday stubble sprinkled over his chin. Even at 25, crow's feet fan like the delta beside his eyes, signaling the life he lived well beyond his years. His wardrobe consisted mostly of black jeans and size small soccer jerseys he collected while overseas in the service. He liked to mutter under his breath in class. My regular seat was 2 rows behind him, and before we met, I decided I didn't like him. Les was born at Charity Hospital in downtown New Orleans. Most of his classmates growing up were from the Ivorville projects, the brick housing complex north of Rampart Street that is the crown jewel of what remains of the project system, no doubt due to their proximity to the quarter and Interstate 10. The summer before we met, Les spent 8 weeks straight on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico out of Port Fourchon, Louisiana, working with roughnecks who called Les the Horse. Most men worked 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. Les never took a day that whole summer, fearing he would never come back. He was paid $8 an hour, but racked up overtime pay, working endless 16-hour days. We often rode home together after class, always the same route, Elysian Fields to Claiborne to Washington Avenue, past the Magnolia Projects and into the Garden District, but always a new set of landmarks to point out. You can't beat Wagner's Meat, the Spur gas station that always had the cheapest gas in the parish, the dental clinic on South Claiborne and First where you could get your grill slugged up with gold fillings. Les, like I, was fond of people and place watching and observational generalizations. My favorite of his, the higher the ponytail, the dumber the girl. Debatable. Les has been called Doc since he was 18 when he joined the Marines as a medic caring for a floating city on an aircraft carrier. A Marine was killed aboard that ship in the middle of the Pacific. The murder was never solved. While a student at LSU In Baton Rouge, Les postponed his education to finish his reserve commitment with a six-month tour in Panama that he later regretted. He lost a soldier to a sniper wound deep in the jungle. The tour wiped out his debt to the military and wiped him out in some ways. I don't think Les was too affected by caring for casualties. I think he felt left behind, trying to catch up with his life in a city that didn't take to progress. After leaving Panama in the military, Les returned to New Orleans and enrolled at UNO, more bitter and a few more months behind on his plan. He worked evenings at an uptown hospital, drawing blood and a stipend from the GI Bill that carried him through college. Classes didn't seem to faze him. There are many pre-med casualties who can't seem to make it past animal physiology. That was me. Though Les pulled an A in organic chemistry, the bellwether course, without a sweat, he approaches intelligence with self-depreciation. Les is fast to agree, but at times easy to offend. Light a cigarette around him and you would be in better company smoking besides a propane tank. He can dismiss the subject with a sneer. He's fond of calling people jokers and will be the first person to throw a dirty look at someone yammering on their cell phone. He's fearless of reproach. One story sums this up. Les took the Desire bus to visit a Marine buddy in the Ninth Ward. He was the only white person on board. He took a seat in the back. 4 young men sitting across the aisle demanded that he move to the front. Les turned around and said, "Make me." He earned the respect of the group and taunts towards the ringleader whose command went unheeded. Les had protection for these scenarios. He always carried a big pen for phone numbers and as a weapon that would fit nicely in someone's neck. 2 years later, Les finished at UNO and got accepted to medical school in Brooklyn. Though his younger and older brothers are both licensed vets, Les was the first person to graduate college in his family. At Downstate Medical College in Brooklyn, he was one of 2 out-of-state students in his class. The other was from Connecticut. Les has always wanted to be an internist. An internist in Scotland once jokingly described to me the universal difference between general practitioners and specialists. Specialists will diagnose an infliction consistent with their specialty. See a gastroenterologist for cramps, and she'll tell you it's a stomach problem. For the same symptoms, a urologist will describe bladder-related diagnosis. An internist, the doctor said, won't know anything. During his medical school interview in New York, Les was the only interviewee not to show up in a full suit. He wore slacks and a sport jacket. The interviewer, an Italian-American woman, asked him what specialty he hoped to practice. Les joked that he wanted to be a mole. Doubtless a Southern cracker had career intentions of performing circumcisions on Jewish babies. While many American doctors are products of pushy parents who spend thousands enrolling their children in Kaplan courses to prepare them for years of overwork and worries, volunteering in hospitals and joining honor societies, Les was a working man. The educational system in America stresses excellence and standardized testing, but nothing, especially in medicine, comes standard. When Les was accepted to medical school in New York, he said he shot for the moon. He was accepted not because he would make a good student, but because he would make a great doctor. New Orleans is the biggest city in the Deep South, a fabled landscape of Cajuns and cotton fields lost to the American consciousness since the Civil Rights era. Before Katrina, New Orleans popped into the national news once a year during Mardi Gras, when snippets of carnival footage were broadcast for a few seconds at the end of the evening news as a smiling-inducing send-off. To understand the big and little picture of a city such as New Orleans and her people and her customs is to understand their planning and response. It's not easy to rebuild a city that wasn't too fond of progress to begin with. Those intent on making it big moved to the great metropolises. Those retreating from the trauma of the wide world, like Darrell, returned to the womb of a city where just getting by is ambitious enough. For a city of its size, New Orleans has more traditions, history, and popular influence than many small countries. New Orleans is a city tied to its neighborhoods and housing projects that are shouted out in hip-hop tunes and saluted on silkscreen T-shirts with the same reverence given to fallen heroes. To me, New Orleans has that pickup trucks and palm trees vibe where you roll the windows down, rest your elbow on the door frame, and make the uptown loop, past the oaks and mansions and swing back through downtown, past the palm trees lining Canal Street. Except for about 3 weeks a year, it feels like a Riviera. Not a beach for 50 miles, but after a day of work, driving home, you feel like you're headed to one. So the last time I saw Darrell, I drove him across the west bank of the Mississippi on the Crescent City connection. We headed to a Home Depot to return leftover fencing material from a job he never completed. Afterwards, we stopped at a diner for low-grade steak that required Darrell to summon the waitress twice more for gravy. He called her doll and through rotted teeth as he poured the gravy and explained his situation. He needed a new liver because after many dormant years without detection, hepatitis C started smoldering in his immune system, progressing beyond a cure. Daryl put his name on the transplant list, but he didn't think he deserved to be there. The next day, Daryl held a yard sale on the lawn in front of his house. He didn't advertise in the paper. Whoever drove by brought away his furniture until he was left with almost nothing. I salvaged a Phillips head screwdriver with a neon green handle. Daryl took the money from the sale and booked a one-way flight to Seattle, where he was prepared to die in the city's VA hospital. Les predicted his demise with a realistic detachment when he heard of Daryl's situation. The only question was time. Les described the dire circumstances doctors find themselves in with patients who are in too much pain to go on, but their bodies won't let them die. For drug addicts with helpful friends, the way out is easy. Dr. Death is sold on street corners all over America. Pump too much heroin in your veins and you'll die of euphoria. As Les described the scenario, you're so happy you forget to breathe. A message flashes on a city bus crawling down Canal. It's carnival time. Anybody still left in the city who hasn't gone on vacation somewhere with ski slopes comes out of the woodwork to see the parades on St. Charles. Les and Daryl and I watching the people, the floats, the marchers. And that's when New Orleans is back, when getting back to work as usual is ignoring work as usual, and the laws that infringe upon the irreverence in all of us. This is America because a place like this can't exist anywhere else. Come heaven or high water, there's no place like home, however you imagine it. So 20 years has passed, and where are they now? Doc Moorhead is now a proper doctor. He got his MD, did his residency in Shreveport, and now he's at the Queens Medical Center in Honolulu. He's a hospitalist. He's a generalist and internist, as he always said he would be. And that nickname he was given on the oil rigs, the horse, it helped him, and it helped many, many, many people, particularly during the pandemic, for his service to the people of Hawaii and the larger South Pacific region. He was the first person in the state of Hawaii to receive the COVID vaccine. He's married, has a beautiful young daughter, and we trade Christmas cards. I don't see him as much as I'd like to. Daryl's a different story, a very, very different story. Allegedly, this happened. I had written this story on a blog, which I'd long forgotten about. A couple of years ago, I got an email from a sorority girl at Tulane, and there had been somebody who had been creeping out on some of these sorority houses and student living areas, particularly where young women lived, and was essentially a peeping Tom. He was caught on surveillance camera, and the cops believed it to be Daryl, allegedly. She sent me a picture, and it sure looked like him. Looked like he gained about 25 pounds. And to be honest, I was more creeped out by the fact that this happened than he committed murder. And if he had told me about this predilection, I certainly wouldn't have lived with him for the time that I did. As for me, I'm a father. I'm a nonprofit lifer, and I got a podcast, and I encourage you to keep listening. Thanks as always for tuning in. We'll be back next Friday and every Friday with new episodes all across America. All Across America is produced by me, Marco Vig, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Visit us on Instagram at All Across America. Check out our website, allacrossamerica.com. There's an interactive map with all our episodes, and there's a Contact Us page where you can send your reactions, guest ideas, and suggestions. So get in touch, stay connected. To me, that's what podcasting is all about. Thanks for listening.